And you see the DNA with 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. And I ask you, what's the origin of that? And you say chance and necessity.
Assuming that we accept that the genetic code qualifies as a simple form of language, is it evidence of God?
You guys might be familiar with my brother from another mother here, Stephen Woodford. I just came across this video that he put out where he's basically attempting to take down the argument from DNA pointing towards God, right? So if you're familiar, language is always a product of intelligence. The genetic code is a language. The genetic code is a product of intelligence. And by the way, he says, yeah, this is logically valid, but he, in this video, focuses on attacking primarily premise one by saying that language is not always a product of intelligence. He brings in John Perry here to help him make the case. They use some interesting examples and analogies along the way. And ultimately here you can see they say this is their main claim. Language can also emerge through the process of co-evolution. And they get into explaining why. I'm going to be reacting to this video and showing what I see as a significant problem with their attempt to debunk the original syllogism. Let's go ahead and try to take this video as seriously as we can. Let's listen to the setup. Let's listen to the teardown that they do of this original syllogism. And then I'm going to explain what I just think that they're getting totally wrong in the end. And so with all of that in view, let us dive in.
To the topic at hand, DNA. Is it really fair to call it a language? And if so, does this language really act as evidence for intelligent design? If you listen to geneticists or read their public-facing articles, you really do find researchers casually referring to the language of DNA. For instance, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History has an article on human evolution titled DNA, the Language of Life. Other scientists are even applying the tools of linguistics to the study of the human genome. Once you delve into these articles, you quickly see that they never claim that DNA itself is a language. DNA is a molecule. Instead, they point out that this thing that textbooks call the genetic code is surprisingly language-like. The genetic code is a set of rules by which genes, made of either DNA or RNA, code for proteins. And while this code is very different from human languages such as English and Mandarin, if we define language as any method of signal-based communication, then the genetic code certainly fits the bill. In solidarity with many geneticists who are impressed by DNA's linguistic qualities, I will go along with calling DNA, or more specifically the genetic code, a simple form of language. Fair enough. Assuming that we accept that the genetic code qualifies as a simple form of language, is it evidence of God? Well, let's see how creationists are making their case.
You've got to have a language to read the information. And DNA itself has the information that makes the language to read the information. And you know one of the things that we found out? Languages only ever come from an intelligence, and information only ever comes from information. DNA cries out that there's an intelligence behind life. It couldn't have happened by chance random processes. Matter on its own could never produce DNA. But if life evolved, matter had to produce DNA. But that could never happen.
Alrighty. For the sake of clarity, let's put Ham's argument into a syllogism. When Ham says,
languages only ever come from an intelligence,
he's provided us with his first premise, that being that language is always a product of intelligence. And when he says,
DNA cries out that there's an intelligence behind life,
he's provided the second premise, albeit a little disconcerted, that being DNA, or more accurately, the genetic code, is a language. Finally, given these premises, Ham gets his conclusion of the genetic code being a product of intelligence. Now, this argument is, of course, logically valid, since the conclusion follows from the premises.
That is an important admission because as he kind of breaks down what he finds to be problematic, we're going to see why those reasons aren't valid, which means that the affirmation here that this argument is logically valid, if the premises are true, this is an important thing to note.
And so the emphasis is on whether or not the premises are sound, whether they are true. Ham defends these premises through analogies, typically referencing Morse code, but before we offer objections, let's witness an implicit presentation of the same argument defended with a similar analogy from John Lennox.
But you see, there's one area where the simple to the complex explanation does not work. And that is the area where language is involved. If you see your name written on Long Beach or something, 4 or 5 letters of your name, you infer immediately upwards to an intelligent input. No matter what mechanism put that there, you do that. Now, the fascinating thing, and I often suggest it to my fellow professors, I say, look, you go into your laboratory and you see the DNA with 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. And I ask you, what's the origin of that? And you say, chance and necessity. When you'll see anything with language on it, 4 or 5 letters, and immediately you say intelligent input.
So Professor Lennox emphasizes that if we saw a few letters written on a beach, we'd infer immediately to an intelligent input. Instantly, we'd recognize the letters, the symbols, as something consciously written by an intelligent being. From here, by way of analogy, Lennox notes that DNA, and by DNA here he actually means the human genome, consists of billions of symbols, of letters, and then expresses incredulity at the fact that his fellow professors do not, like him, immediately infer to an intelligent input. Again, Lennox's argument is implicit, but it's actually precisely the same as Ham's. He's asserting that when it comes to language, we
infer immediately upwards to an intelligent input.
And he then accentuates that the genetic code is a language that consists of many symbols arranged in very specific orders.
And you see the DNA with 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order.
Okay, so there's the argument, loud and clear. The genetic code is a language, and language only comes from intelligence. Got it. Now, don't be fooled, my fellow apes. The DNA argument is really nothing new. It's yet another appeal to ignorance fallacy. No one currently knows how language naturally arises, therefore language cannot naturally arise. Or, the proposition of language emerging naturally hasn't been demonstrated to be true, therefore it's false. This, I hope you can see, is every bit as fallacious, illogical, and unreasonable as when Paley insisted that complexity can only come from intelligent design.
Let's just be clear here. This argument that Lennox is making, and actually that Ken Ham is making, is not a God of the Gaps argument for this reason. A legitimate God of the Gaps argument would be this. Material causes cannot produce or explain specified information. Conclusion, therefore, an intelligent cause produced the specified information in life. That would be an argument from ignorance version, but that is a straw man. Okay, that is not what's actually being said here. What's actually being said here is this. Despite a thorough search, no materialistic causes have been discovered with the power to produce large amounts of specified information necessary to produce the first cell. Premise 2, intelligent causes have demonstrated the power to produce large amounts of specified information. Conclusion, intelligent design constitutes the best, most causally adequate explanation for the origin of the specified information in the cell. Ironically, the motive reasoning that is used to connect the dots between the specified information inside of DNA and an intelligent designer or coder of that code is actually Darwin's own method of reasoning, which was inference to the best explanation. So we actually have Darwin to thank. That's probably worth noting.
Thus, the only refuge that the genetic code can offer theists is the fact that we don't yet know where it came from in the first place. Right now, language might seem like a safe space for Jesus, but do you really want to repeat the errors of our ancestors by basing your faith on, I must say, an obvious appeal to ignorance?
And here it just seems like he's saying that he has faith in the idea that there is going to be some other thing that's going to come out of the woodworks in the future. I mean, maybe, but right now, again, we're inferring to the best explanation given all of the actual evidence and data that we have. Okay, here comes John Perry.
Oops, I forgot to turn my phone off before recording.
So this is interesting because here's really where it gets into the debunking part. So this was all, so far this has kind of just been a basic setup. In fact, I might even just scrub past this. Now we're going to get into them tearing down this syllogism for how the genetic code points to God. So here we go.
That is a bit embarrassing, but wouldn't you know, this is John Perry. That's the guy I was telling you about earlier that's helped me with, well, pretty much the whole video, so we'll answer this. Hey, John.
Stephen, brother. Look, I'm sorry to break the fourth wall here. Great presentation. I'm loving it so far, but did you just say that language is a safe space for Jesus?
No, I said that language might seem like a safe space for Jesus for now, but who knows when science will catch up. Like, eventually it will close the gap, I assume.
Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do here. Okay, I've read the Bible. People were really mean to that guy. If anyone deserves a safe space, I'm sure it's Jesus. But language is not the safe space that Ken Ham and John Lennox seem to think it is.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that scientists already figured out how exactly the genetic code emerged?
Exactly how it emerged? No. Lots of details remain a mystery, but rapid progress is being made on that front. Most importantly here, though, we already understand in principle how simple languages like the genetic code come about.
Ooh, this ought to be good.
Language can be the product of a mind, as Ken Ham says, but language can also emerge through the process of co-evolution.
That's the primary claim that they're going to make and unpack, and we're going to show is problematic. Let's get it.
Now that is interesting. Language can emerge through the process of co-evolution.
Yeah, correct. If Ken Ham and John Lennox want to be honest men, if they want to, they will need to modify their first premise. Do you mind if I explain?
Yeah, dude.
As Stephen mentioned, there is what some people are calling a language at the heart of biology. Scientists usually call it the...
That's a really cool admission, by the way. I watched this whole 2-hour plus video podcast that they did together, and he is really clear that this actually is... that this actually can be considered a language. Now, we're going to expose why he does some very shifty sleight of hand stuff and kind of creates this massive, elaborate straw man in a second here. But I do think it's important to note that he is calling the genetic code a language, or it functions like a language, which, by the way, a lot of atheists will try to wiggle around that. He's actually here saying, hey, I've looked at this long and hard enough, and that is a valid way of describing genetic code. But even like Richard Dawkins, right, like the great and powerful Richard Dawkins, admits the same. So I think it's helpful. Maybe we can move past that objection that it's not a language, that it's just chemicals, in light of the fact that even some of the top atheistic scientists in this relevant field are actually acknowledging at least this much. Let's continue.
Genetic code. It's this thing right here. Let me stress again that this code is incredibly simple compared to human languages like English, but still, how on earth did even a simple language end up inside our cells? What even are we? Well, it turns out that biology is filled with what you could call simple languages. To avoid confusion with human languages, biologists usually call them codes or signaling systems. For some reason, the word gets 2 L's when British scientists write about it. But no matter how you choose to spell it, biological signaling systems allow communication between different biological entities. You have senders and you have receivers. A sender and a receiver might be 2 individuals from the same species. Birds vocalize to warn off rivals and to attract mates, for example. Here, the sender and receiver both happen to have thinking minds, and, like us, they communicate with vocalizations, but thinking brains are not always needed for communication, and signals do not need to be sounds. Senders and receivers might be individuals from different species. Plants, even though they don't have thinking brains or voice boxes, really do send signals to bees, butterflies, and all sorts of pollinators. As I'm sure you are all aware, flowers are a plant's sex organs. Something fun to think about next time you stop to smell the roses. But flowers are also signaling structures. They're like little billboards saying, "Hello, critters, come pollinate me." Their enhanced colors, shapes, and fragrances evolved under selection pressure to communicate with pollinators. In other cases, senders and receivers might be large groups of organisms. Individuals within groups of bacteria send out molecular signals to their kin all the time. This allows them to coordinate group behaviors, a phenomenon called quorum sensing. Okay. Senders and receivers might be different tissues within the same body. Our hormone or endocrine system is an intertissue chemical signaling system. A lion cub's fur, for example, before puberty, has the potential to develop down either a male or a female pathway. If an individual happens to have testicles, those testicles will make testosterone molecules during puberty, which spread through the bloodstream along with other hormones, other signaling molecules. When those hormones connect with special receptors inside the cells of hair follicles, the lion begins to grow his mane.
All right.
It's not too unscientific to say that a lion's balls are talking to his hair. Glorious. Finally, senders and receivers might be two different structures inside of a single cell. The genetic code represents this type of signaling system. Now, DNA doesn't act...
This is where the sleight of hand is starting to begin. Okay, so he's just described a number of different things that are signaling, right? Different ways that we can see signaling in nature. And he's right that the genetic code is a signaling system. That's true. But it's not just any kind of signaling system. It's digital, symbolic, and has a rule-based code where the triplet codons correspond arbitrarily to amino acids, not via chemical necessity, but by convention, much like the Morse code or a written text. This is the big difference that I think he, again, is kind of saying, like, language, the lion's cojones are talking to his hair. If you want to call that like communication or language, I guess you can, but we're really talking in that case about a pure chemical reaction. So let me explain this. With the genetic code, here's what's required: a translation mechanism, tRNA plus the ribosome. Secondly, a sender-receiver dynamic. Third, no direct chemical affinity between code and product. So in other words, there is a coding and a decoding, and there has to be a correct interpretation of the meaning of those symbols. That is, I think, something worth noting. So this is fundamentally different than pheromones or hormones, which work via direct chemical properties. Now, in the case of the cell, the discovery of information was good and useful, obviously, but information can also be used for nefarious purposes. In fact, for those who don't already know, data brokers will sell your information without your knowledge and in many cases without your consent. This is something I really did not feel the weight of until the past few years when I realized the actual risks this exposes you to. So today I'm telling you guys about a company called Incogni because the service they provide is actually useful. They hunt down where your information has been leaked and scrub it from all those databases. They tackle the legal hassle of requesting your information to be removed, which restores your online security and privacy, but it also spares you a lot of time and stress. Believe me, I know this the hard way. It's actually a very good feeling not having to worry about your personal information falling into the hands of bad actors. Incogni has also helped me to cut out those annoying spam calls and emails. So break up with Scam Likely. Take back control of your online privacy. Check out incogni.com/dose of wisdom or use the promo code dose of wisdom in the link below to get a whopping 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Once again, that's incogni.com/dose of wisdom or use the promo code dose of wisdom to get 60% off.
The genetic code really is a chemical signaling system. Genes, usually made of DNA, transmit chains of messenger RNA to special structures called ribosomes. Ribosomes are protein-building complexes. They interpret every 3 nucleotides in a messenger RNA as a signal. Signals we call codons. Ribosomes build...
So he's getting into this, but again, note what he's not getting into. Note that he is omitting the critical difference between these two things for the reasons that I said. Actually, maybe he will. Let's see what he says here.
Build specific proteins according to the instructions, the sequence of codons in the chain of messenger RNA. Genes really do communicate with ribosomes. What do they communicate about? Well, genes tell ribosomes how to build specific types of protein. Creationists are in awe of these communication systems, and I do not blame them. These things are absolutely fascinating. So fascinating, in fact, that I have dedicated a huge chunk of my career to helping teach other people how these communication systems work. I absolutely love them. And I do understand why creationists think that these communication systems might be some sort of evidence for God. Each signal, whether it be a codon in DNA or the pigment in a flower,
This is key.
it means something specific to the receiver. It has a meaning that does not exist outside that communication system, a meaning that somehow needed to be assigned to its signal.
Okay, now this is interesting because here he's almost conceding the problem. If a signal's meaning must be assigned, who or what assigns it? In symbolic systems, meaning doesn't come from physics and chemistry alone. It requires an arbitrary rule. This is the entire point. It requires a repeatable and known meaning of the symbol. So SOS means what we know it to mean because that meaning was assigned to it. Let's note that because he's actually getting close to the problem with his debunking right here, but let's keep going.
Something truly special really is happening here. Signals aren't simply assigned their meanings by the cold laws of physics, not the cold laws of physics alone. Creationists are completely wrong, however, when they insist that a signal can only be assigned a meaning by an intelligent mind.
Okay, wow.
Language can also emerge through the process of co-evolution.
Evolution. Okay, let's hear it.
If you only remember one thing from the day that John Perry commandeered the YouTube channel of Rationality Rules, let it be that language can also emerge through the process of co-evolution.
Okay, that's his claim. Prove it.
So, what do I even mean by that? Well, when two or more evolving entities, that could be individual organisms, individual genes, are under selection pressure to cooperate, cues can be transformed into signals. Meaning can be naturally assigned. Now, it's probably still not clear what it is that I'm saying here.
It is not.
Let me give you an example that's a little bit more familiar to most people than genetics. Let's look at how signaling emerges in flowers, in plants. Again, flowers are a plant's sex organs. Pollen grains contain plant sperm cells, which can fertilize the egg cells, the seeds, of neighboring plants. Many plant species simply count on the wind to spread their pollen to neighboring plants. And in fact, if you suffer from allergies in the springtime, the reason for that is because you have been breathing in too much plant sperm. So, another lovely thought for you. Pollen, it turns out, is loaded with nutritious protein. Because of this, all sorts of bugs and small animals have evolved to seek out plants that are producing pollen so that they can eat that pollen. Here we are looking at a cycad plant, sometimes pronounced cycad. Cycads have not evolved flowers. Instead, they still produce pollen and seeds inside pine cone-like structures. The first true flowers evolved from structures fairly similar to these cones. This cycad cone...
Guys, I'm just saying, hang in there because this section right here is supposed to be his answer to how... This is supposed to be the core of his debunking, and because he's going into this detail, it's sort of like a elaborate red herring, but try to just track what he's actually saying here. Hang in there. It's like 2 more minutes, and then we're going to highlight the problem.
...is absolutely infested with pollen-eating beetles. Early on in the cycad-beetle relationship, an infestation like this would have been horrible news for the plant. But once a plant population has been targeted by pollen predators for several generations, adaptations begin to take hold. Any random mutation that makes pollen occasionally stick to the body of a pollen predator will end up being favored by natural selection. This is because pollen predators visit many plants while feeding. In the process, they accidentally bring uneaten pollen directly to those plants, triggering fertilization. Here we have the start of a co-evolution process. As bugs evolve to become better and better at finding pollen, plants evolve pollen that is better and better at hitching a ride on those bugs. Eventually, there might come a point where insect pollination is actually more efficient than wind pollination. When you think about it, it's not that difficult to reach that point because wind pollination is extremely sloppy. The pollen goes everywhere. So even if you do have predators that are eating a lot of pollen in the process of pollinating, Well, that's okay. You're sacrificing some grains of pollen, but not nearly as much as you would be sacrificing to the wind. A typical insect will use visual cues, plus what you could call their sense of smell, to find pollen-producing plants. These smells, the colors, the specific shapes of leaves that happen to have been associated with pollen in the past, those are the cues that an insect looks for when hunting for pollen.
Okay, let me pause here. I think this is the end of his his example.
Any random mutation a plant has that happens to magnify any one of those cues, transforming those cues into signals, that mutation will help an insect find the plant sooner.
Okay, so let's pause here while this is on the screen, because this is the point. Okay, just track with me here. He's just given a detailed example, using flowers and bees co-evolving. But remember what he's trying to do here. He's trying to show that this is a thing that we can look to see that actually language can emerge naturalistically, that language is not actually mind derivative. That's ultimately the point that they're making, right? Because they're debunking, John Lennox and Ken Ham and so on. So let's see, how good of a job did he do? So it's a nice illustration, but what is this, what he just showed here, an illustration of? I would say pretty clearly it's an illustration of natural selection and adaptation. But it doesn't show cue enhancement. It doesn't show symbolic code emergence. The plants didn't invent a symbolic alphabet and assign it arbitrary meanings. There's no encoding and decoding happening. There's no translation mechanism involved whatsoever. So it's totally irrelevant to the uniqueness of the genetic code. It's like a giant, that's why I'm calling it an elaborate red herring, because it's a detailed explanation of a different thing that he's kind of then draping the word language over top of, but while describing something that's fundamentally different than what genetic code is.
The faster a plant is found, the more other plants it will pollinate, the more offspring it will have. Over just a few generations, that new mutation will spread all throughout the plant population. At this point, an evolutionary arms race has begun between plants. Who can signal the loudest? The race is on. Modern cycads have already reached the point where they benefit from pollen predators. While they have not yet evolved anything we'd want to call a true flower, they have evolved brightly colored pine cones, which beetles can see from a long distance away. They've also evolved strong-smelling molecules, which they release into the air when pollen is ready. The stench is somewhat foul to our noses, but heavenly for these little beetles. True flowers and their languages can be extremely complex. Language complexity depends on the species, but flowers can send many different types of messages to their pollinators. These include specific signals for when pollen is ready, whether or not nectar is also available, and some species have even evolved signals that warn pollinators if they've already been pollinated and will no longer be providing treats.
Languages only ever come from an intelligence.
Sorry, Ken, but you do need to rewrite your syllogism.
Okay.
Language can also emerge through the process of co-evolution.
Okay, so hold on. So he's gone back to making that claim, but did he support the claim? He just said the genetic code. Well, actually, let's play this a second longer.
In short, the code likely emerged as primitive genes and primitive ribosomes co-evolved to cooperate in the production of proteins, much like flower signals emerged as insects and plants co-evolved to cooperate in pollination.
Okay, so let's pause there, because that's basically his argument. Just to repeat that, he says the genetic code likely emerged as primitive genes and ribosomes co-evolved to cooperate in the production of proteins. Now, in case it's not obvious, this is obviously speculative, and he's assuming what he needs to prove. He's just given you, again, a description of something different, labeled it as something the same, and then now he's smuggling it back into the original idea that he's trying to get across here, which is that there's a problem with the original syllogism by saying that sometimes, actually, let's go back a second, because he says sometimes. He's saying Where is it? Yeah, language is sometimes a product of intelligence. And the reason he's crossing out always and saying sometimes is because he just gave us a explanation of something different that he's saying is the same in order to give an example of how language can emerge without, as not as a product of intelligence. And so, but the question is, has he actually done that? Has he actually made that case? No, he hasn't. There's no direct evidence that a symbolic system with decoding machinery co-evolved gradually. Even leading origin of life researchers, by the way, admit this, like Eugene Koonin. He admits that the origin of the genetic code remains deeply mysterious. So what they're kind of left to do here is say, we don't actually have anything evidence-based that we can look to in order to debunk the syllogism that I read earlier in this video. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you some examples of signaling, some examples of how hormones and pheromones work. We're going to call those things linguistic in nature when they're not. And then we're going to try to use that as a basis to show that language can emerge materialistically. Okay, so I've written this down in order to be as succinct and clear as possible. This is the problem in a nutshell. The concept of coevolution, the mutual adaptation of organisms over time, fails to address a deeper foundational issue, the origin of the information encoded in DNA. Coevolution presupposes already existing organisms capable of reproduction and variation, but the central enigma is upstream from this question. And that enigma is this: how did the digitally encoded language-like instructions within DNA arise in the first place? DNA is not just a chemical matter. It stores prescriptive information using a symbolic code that is abstract and context dependent, qualities not explainable by chemical laws alone. Natural selection and coevolution may be able to shape existing sequences, but they cannot generate a code system from mere physical processes. So let's just make this crystal clear. There is no empirical evidence that coevolution or any undirected material process can spontaneously produce a functional code complete with a decoding system and error correction mechanisms as well, all of which must be in place for DNA to even be read or replicated. So this is a classic chicken and egg problem. The machinery needed to interpret the information in DNA is itself encoded by DNA. Moreover, coevolution explains how organisms respond to selective pressures, not how semantically meaningful functional sequences emerge in the first place out of the combinatorial chaos. There's a whole other video we could do on the combinatorial problem. The chance of random mutations assembling the kind of functional information we are observing in living systems is so astronomically low that it is effectively zero. So in short, coevolution is a downstream process that operates only once life and its information processing machinery already exist. It is descriptive of biological processes at most, but it is not capable of creating biological information. Therefore, invoking coevolution, which is the primary argument in this entire video, to explain the origin of DNA's information-rich structure is literally like trying to explain the existence of language by referencing various works of literature. It presupposes what it's supposed to be explaining. I think that's enough for one video. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section, regardless of where you're coming into this conversation from. You're welcome here. I'm learning as well. So let's do it together. See you guys in the next one. Peace.